gave birth in chains. That was how they wanted my child to enter the world, broken before he even took his first breath. But when my babies finally opened their eyes, every white person standing over me stepped back like they had seen something that should not exist. My name is Sarah, and in the summer of 1857, I was 23 years old, 8 months pregnant, and chained like an animal inside a wooden cabin on the Whitmore plantation in Alabama. The iron around my wrists had been there 6 weeks, 6 weeks of sleeping in shackles, 6 weeks of eating in shackles, 6 weeks of trying to move my swollen body while a short chain pulled against my bones every time I reached too far. At first the metal cut my skin. By the second week the wounds stopped bleeding. By the fourth week my body had simply accepted the pain. Not because it hurt less, but because there was no escaping it. The cabin smelled of wood, sweat, and dust. Outside the cotton fields stretched farther than my eyes could follow. 200 acres of white plants that made one man rich and made the rest of us grow old before our time. Nathaniel Whitmore owned all of it, the land, the cotton, the cabins, and every human body that lived on that plantation. He believed God had designed the world that way. White men owned, black people worked, and anyone who questioned that order had to be punished. That punishment was the iron around my wrists, but the chains didn't start with cruelty. They started with words. 6 weeks earlier I had been in the main house kitchen, stirring a pot of stew over the fire while dinner was being prepared. I wasn't supposed to listen. Enslaved people were meant to hear only what we were told. But voices carry through wooden walls, and that afternoon, I heard something that stopped my heart. Nathaniel Whitmore and his brother James were sitting in the dining room, drinking whiskey, talking about business, talking about money. Then they started talking about my baby. When she delivers, James said, I'll take the child. My wife and I haven't been blessed with one of our own. And if we decide we don't want it, he laughed softly, we can sell it in Mobile. Nathaniel answered like they were discussing livestock. You'll have first choice. She's been more trouble than she's worth since she got pregnant anyway. My hands froze over the pot. The spoon stopped moving. The room around me went silent. They had already decided my child's future. Before the baby even existed in the world. Before I had held him. Before he had taken a breath. Sold. Separated. Gone. Just like that. Something inside my chest cracked open. Not loudly. Not like anger. More like a door finally breaking after years of pressure. That night Nathaniel Whitmore came through the quarters for inspection. He did it every week, walking slowly between the cabins, reminding us with his presence who owned our lives. I stepped forward. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might break my ribs. My hands were shaking. And for the first time in my life, I looked directly into his eyes. You will not take my child. The words fell into the silence like a stone in water. No one moved. No one breathed. Nathaniel's face darkened. What did you say? My baby, I said. You will not take my baby. The slap came fast, hard enough to split my lip. I tasted blood immediately. But I stayed standing. And then, I did something worse. Something no enslaved person was supposed to do. I pushed him, both hands against his chest, hard enough to make him stumble backward into the doorframe. For one impossible second, The whole world stopped. Then Nathaniel Whitmore shouted for the overseer, Curtis Webb, a man whose name alone made people quiet. Within the hour, iron cuffs were locked around my wrists. Heavy ones, the kind meant to hold grown men. Nathaniel watched while they fastened the chain, his voice calm, cold, satisfied. The kind meant to hold grown men. Nathaniel watched while they fastened the chain, his voice calm, cold, satisfied. Let her labor in chains. Let her remember what happens when property forgets its place. That was how the last 6 weeks of my pregnancy began. With iron, with pain, and with a promise whispered into the darkness every night as I rested my shackled hands against my stomach. I won't let them take you. I don't know how yet, but I won't. What I didn't know then was that the child inside me wasn't alone. And when the time finally came, what entered the world that morning would change everything on that plantation forever. The first night in chains was the worst. Not because the iron was new, but because my body had not yet learned how to survive it. 8 months pregnant, my belly heavy enough to pull me forward whenever I tried to sit. But the chain between my wrists was too short to let me balance. If I leaned forward, the metal cut into my skin. If I leaned back, the weight of the baby crushed my spine. There was no position that didn't hurt, only positions that hurt differently. Sleep came in small pieces, 10 minutes, maybe 20. Then my back would cramp, or the baby would shift, or the chain would tighten and wake me again. By morning my arms were shaking so badly I could barely lift the cup of water Penny brought me. Penny was barely 16, too young to carry the kind of fear she carried in her eyes every time she stepped near me. You need to drink, she whispered. Ruth says the baby needs water. Ruth had delivered more babies than anyone on that plantation. 63 years old. Small hands, but steady ones. Hands that had caught children in fields, in cabins, in barns. Sometimes in the middle of the night with nothing but a candle and prayer. When she saw the chains the first time, her mouth tightened so hard the skin around it turned white. But she said nothing, because saying the wrong thing could get you whipped. Or worse. Instead, she brought me water, extra cloth, and sometimes, when the overseer wasn't watching, she rubbed my swollen ankles. They don't understand nothing about birthing, she muttered one evening. A woman needs to move when the time comes. Chains don't let the body work right. I already knew that. My body told me every hour. By the 3rd week, the swelling in my legs was so bad my skin looked stretched thin as paper. Dark circles sank under my eyes. Every movement took effort. But the baby kept moving, rolling, kicking, reminding me that something inside me still wanted to live. At night, I would rest my shackled hands against my belly and whisper, I'm still here. I'm still fighting. Outside the quarters, the plantation kept moving like nothing had changed. Cotton needed picking. Meals needed cooking. The sun rose and set over the fields exactly the same way it had the day before. Suffering did not stop the harvest. Nathaniel Whitmore came once a week to check on me. Not out of concern, out of satisfaction. He would stand in the doorway with his hands behind his back, looking down at the chains like a farmer inspecting a fence. Still defiant? He asked Curtis Webb once. Curtis shook his head. She don't say much anymore. Nathaniel looked pleased. Good. Pain teaches obedience. But pain was not teaching what he thought it was. The nights were long enough to think. Long enough to remember my mother. She died when I was 12. Fever took her in 3 days. But before she died, she told me something I never forgot. They can work your body to death, she said, but they cannot touch the place where you know who you are. 6 weeks in chains, and I began to understand what she meant. My body was breaking. That part was true. My wrists bled. My legs swelled. Sometimes I could barely stand. But inside, something refused to bend. Not hope. Hope felt too fragile, too easy to crush. What I felt was something older, something stubborn, the simple knowledge that I was still human, and no iron on earth could change that. By early September, I could barely walk. The baby had dropped lower. Pressure built in my hips like the ground itself was splitting. Every step felt like something inside me might tear. Ruth watched me carefully. One afternoon she knelt beside me and pressed her hand against my belly. Her eyes narrowed. "Not long now," she said quietly. "Could be days. Maybe sooner." Curtis Webb carried the news to Nathaniel. The answer came back simple. Cold. Exactly what I expected. "When the time comes," Nathaniel said, "someone can attend her. But the chains stay on." She brought this on herself. After that I stopped thinking about the future. It hurt less that way. There was only breath, pain, breath again. Sometimes I thought about Thomas, the father of the child inside me. We had met during one of the seasonal work exchanges between plantations. A few stolen conversations. A few stolen moments under the trees. When he heard about the chains, he tried to run to me. They caught him before he made it 5 miles. I never saw him again. September came in thick and humid. The air heavy enough to press against your lungs. The cotton harvest in full swing. Everyone in the fields from dawn until dark. I spent most days alone in the dim cabin. The chain clinking every time I moved. The baby shifting lower and lower inside me. Then, just after midnight on September 15th, it happened. A sudden warmth spread beneath me, my water breaking across the wooden floor. For a moment, I felt relief, because the waiting was finally over. Then the first contraction hit. The pain exploded through my body like lightning, starting in my back, wrapping around my belly, crushing the air out of my lungs. I folded forward as far as the chain would allow. A sound tore out of my throat that didn't sound human. When it passed, I had maybe 2 minutes before the next one came. "Ruth," I called. My voice cracked. "Ruth, it's time." Ruth arrived first, faster than anyone expected a 63-year-old woman to move. Penny came behind her. Then, Clara. All 3 of them staring at the floor beneath me where the water had already spread across the wood. Ruth didn't waste time. She had seen too many births in her life to hesitate. "Penny," she said quickly, "boil water. Clara, find every clean cloth you can." Then she knelt beside me and placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Breathe, child. You're going to need your strength." Another contraction hit before I could answer. Harder than the first, it twisted through my body like something alive, squeezing every muscle until I thought my ribs would break. I screamed. I couldn't stop it. The sound echoed through the wooden walls of the quarters. Clara ran to the door. "Someone tell Curtis Webb. This baby is coming." 15 minutes later the overseer appeared in the doorway. Curtis Webb looked irritated more than concerned, like someone had woken him too early. He glanced at me once. Then at the chains, then at the women around me. "Mr. Whitmore's orders stand. The chains stay on." Ruth stood slowly. For the first time in years her voice carried something sharp. Something dangerous. "She can't birth properly in chains. You want the baby alive, you take them off." Curtis crossed his arms. "Not my decision. Do what you can."
He stepped outside again, leaving us alone. And the contractions kept coming, closer together now, stronger. My body was trying to move, trying to squat, trying to shift, trying to follow the ancient rhythm of birth, but the chain forced my arms into angles that worked against everything my body needed. Every time I tried to brace myself, the iron dragged me back. Hours passed like that. Pain, breath. Pain again. Sweat soaked my dress. My hands trembled so badly the chain rattled against the floor. Sometimes the world faded at the edges, my vision going gray, my body trying to escape the pain by shutting down. But Ruth kept pulling me back. Stay with me, you hear me, stay with me. Dawn finally began to creep through the cracks in the wooden walls, gray light, cold and thin. I had been in labor 6 hours. And the baby still hadn't come. Nathaniel Whitmore appeared around 7. Fresh clothes, fresh face, like this was just another morning inspection. He looked down at me on the floor, at the sweat, the blood, the chains. The expression on his face was the same one he used when a cow had trouble calving, annoyed. This is taking too long. He turned to Curtis. I have work that needs doing. Half the women are distracted with this nonsense. Ruth didn't look up. Baby comes when it comes. Nathaniel's mouth tightened. Nature should have finished by now. Then he left, like the birth of a human life was an inconvenience. The contractions grew worse. My body shaking uncontrollably, every muscle burning. And then, something changed. Ruth froze, her hands resting against my stomach, her eyes widening slowly. Lord have mercy, she whispered. Henny looked up. What is it? Ruth looked at the 3 women around her, then at me, her voice trembling. There's 2 of them. The room went silent, except for my breathing. Twins, Ruth said. She's carrying twins. Even through the pain I understood what that meant. Danger. More danger than my body already faced. 2 babies. 1 exhausted mother. And iron chains holding everything in the wrong place. Get Curtis, Ruth said immediately. Now. Clara ran again. Moments later the overseer returned. Annoyance written across his face. I told you, there's 2 babies, Ruth interrupted. And if she dies because you left her chained, she stepped closer. That blood is on you. Curtis hesitated. I could see the calculation in his eyes. 2 healthy babies meant profit. A dead woman meant questions. Finally he cursed under his breath, pulled the key from his belt.
The lock clicked open. The weight fell away from my wrists. For the first time in 6 weeks, I was free to move. The relief lasted only seconds before another contraction slammed through my body. But this time, I could lean forward, I could brace myself, I could let my body do what it had been trying to do all night. That's it, Ruth said. Let it come. Let it come. The first baby was born at 9 o'clock in the morning, September 15th, 1857. A boy, small, but alive. His cry filled the room like a protest against the world that had brought him here. Ruth lifted him carefully, cleared his mouth, cut the cord. One down, she said. Rest while you can. The second one's coming. 20 minutes later, the second twin entered the world. Another boy, stronger cry, stronger lungs. Ruth held him up, checking his arms, his legs, making sure everything was right. Then she saw the eyes. Both babies had their eyes open. Unusual, but not impossible. What was impossible was the way they looked at us. Not the empty gaze of newborns, not the wandering eyes of a child who had just entered the world. These eyes focused, clear, steady, like they were seeing something, understanding something. Ruth's hands began to shake. "Penny," she whispered, "go get Curtis. Tell him, he needs to see this."
Curtis Webb came back into the room slowly. Not because he was curious, but because the tone in Penny's voice had unsettled him. Men like Curtis did not scare easily. He had seen beatings, seen deaths, seen things that would haunt most people for the rest of their lives. But when he stepped into that cabin, and looked at the two newborn boys in Ruth's hands, he stopped moving, just like everyone else had. The babies were quiet now. No crying, no thrashing, just staring. Two tiny faces still streaked with blood and birth. Two pairs of eyes wide open, focused, watching him. Curtis shifted his weight. Something inside his chest tightened. He couldn't explain it, and that frightened him more than anything. "What's wrong with them?" he muttered. Ruth shook her head slowly. "Nothing's wrong. But look at them." Curtis did, and the longer he looked, the more uncomfortable he became. Newborn babies weren't supposed to stare like that. They weren't supposed to hold eye contact. They weren't supposed to look like they were studying your face. But these two boys were. And in their eyes there was something strange. Not anger. Not fear. Recognition. Curtis stepped backward. Just one step. But everyone in the room saw it. "What in God's name?" he whispered. By then the news had already begun spreading outside. Someone had told someone else. Voices carried across the quarters. Within minutes more people gathered at the doorway. Silent. Watching. Nathaniel Whitmore arrived shortly after. Still dressed for the morning. Still wearing the same expression of irritation he had earlier. "What is this commotion?" he demanded. Then he saw the babies. Ruth held them carefully. One in each arm. Their small bodies wrapped in cloth. Their eyes still open, still watching. Nathaniel stepped closer, slowly, like a man approaching an animal he didn't trust. The first baby turned his head slightly, and looked straight at him. Nathaniel froze. The second baby did the same. Two newborn boys, looking directly into the face of the man who had chained their mother. The room went completely silent. Even the sounds of the plantation outside seemed to disappear. No crying, no talking, just those eyes. Nathaniel's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For the first time since anyone on that plantation could remember, Nathaniel Whitmore had nothing to say. "What?" he finally whispered. "What are they?" I was barely conscious. My body shaking from exhaustion, blood still soaking the floor beneath me. But I saw them, my sons, my boys, and I saw what everyone else saw. Something inside their gaze, something deep, something impossible. It was not the blank stare of a newborn. It looked like memory, like they had already seen the world, already understood something about it. And in that moment, I realized something else. They had been there, through every contraction, every hour in chains, every moment of pain. They had witnessed it all from inside my body. Nathaniel Whitmore stepped back. Another step. Then another. Margaret Whitmore appeared in the doorway behind him, drawn by the noise, her thin hands gripping the frame as she leaned inside. She looked at the babies, and her face went pale. "Oh my God," she whispered. Curtis crossed himself.
something no one had ever seen him do before. "They ain't normal," he muttered. Ruth turned sharply. "They're babies." But even she could not hide the trembling in her voice. Outside the cabin, the whispers had already begun. People repeating the same words over and over. The twins. The twins. The babies with the eyes. Nathaniel Whitmore stared at them one last time, then turned away abruptly. "Enough of this nonsense," he said, but his voice had lost something. Certainty. "Put the chains back on her." No one moved. Curtis looked at Ruth, then at the babies, then back at Nathaniel. In 15 years, the overseer hesitated to obey, because everyone in that room felt the same thing. Those children had seen something, and somehow they remembered. That afternoon, the story began spreading across the plantation, across neighboring farms, across the county, about a woman who had given birth in chains, about twins who opened their eyes and stared like they already knew the truth. 3 days later, Curtis Webb quit his job and left the plantation. 2 weeks later, Margaret Whitmore stopped sleeping through the night, and Nathaniel Whitmore, the man who believed he controlled everything on that land, began avoiding the quarters completely, because every time he saw those boys watching him, he felt something he had never felt before. Fear. For weeks after the birth, people on the Whitmore plantation moved differently. Quieter, more careful, like something invisible had settled over the land. No one could explain what they had seen that morning, but no one forgot it either. The twins grew quickly. 2 boys, strong lungs, healthy bodies. I named them Daniel and Samuel, names my mother used to whisper when she prayed. Ruth said they were good names, names that sounded like survivors. But it wasn't their strength that people talked about. It was their eyes. Even as babies, they watched everything. When people entered the cabin, their heads turned. When voices rose, their gaze followed the sound. Not like normal infants. Not wandering. Not confused. Focused. Patient. Watching. And when Nathaniel Whitmore walked near the quarters, they went completely still. No crying. No fussing. Just staring at him with those quiet, steady eyes. Ruth noticed it first. One evening, while rocking Samuel, she leaned closer to me. "They remember." I frowned. "Remember what?" Ruth looked toward the door, then back at the boys. The chains. The birth. Everything. I wanted to laugh. Wanted to tell her that was impossible. But when I looked into Daniel's eyes, I couldn't. Because sometimes, just for a moment, it felt like he was looking at me the same way my mother used to. Like he understood more than a child should. Months passed. The story spread. First through whispers between plantations. Then through travelers passing down dusty roads. People began coming to see the twins. Poor farmers. Free black families. Even a few curious white visitors. Some left shaking their heads, calling it superstition. Others walked away quiet, deep in thought. Because when the boys looked at them, something stirred inside their chest. Something uncomfortable. Like being seen too clearly. Nathaniel Whitmore hated it. "They're making a spectacle of this place," he complained. But he never tried to sell them again. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was the memory of those newborn eyes staring at him from my arms. Whatever the reason, my son stayed with me. The world beyond the plantation was changing. Rumors of conflict between North and South drifted through the county. Talk of abolition. Talk of war. But inside the quarters, life was still the same struggle it had always been. Work. Survival. Waiting. waiting for something none of us could quite name. Years later, that waiting ended. In 1865, Union soldiers marched through Alabama. Slavery collapsed under the weight of war. And one morning, for the first time in my life, I walked off the Whitmore plantation without chains. Daniel and Samuel held my hands. 4 years old. Small fingers wrapped tightly around mine. They didn't remember the chains the way I did. But the story of their birth had already spread across the country. Abolitionists had written about it. Preachers had spoken about it. People called them witnesses. Not because they had done anything special, but because their very existence forced people to face the truth. That a woman had been chained while carrying life. That children had entered the world surrounded by cruelty. And that even the innocent could carry testimony. Daniel and Samuel grew into men who taught others to read. Men who spoke about freedom. Men who carried the story of their mother wherever they went. As for me, I kept the scars on my wrists uncovered for the rest of my life. Thin white lines where the iron had cut deepest. People sometimes asked why I didn't hide them, why I didn't try to forget. I always gave them the same answer. Because chains break. But testimony should never disappear. The twins who opened their eyes that morning in 1857 did not bring a curse. They brought a witness. A reminder that even in the darkest places, even in chains, the truth can still be born. And once the truth opens its eyes, no one who sees it can ever pretend they didn't.